Good morning, Ohio. It's James Lewis of This Dream House, the show that's all about the house. And with us today is Bill Pennington, the author of the book, Champs to Chumps, How the Worst Team in Yankees History Led to the 1990s Dynasty. Thank you, Bill, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So there have been hundreds of books written about the Yankees' history. What makes this book so different?
I think what's different about this book is that it talks about failure, or at least it starts in failure. And, that I think what baseball fans in general don't really remember is that the Yankees teams of that era were, extraordinarily bad, and everything was going wrong, really, in the franchise. And, I think people think that, okay, they won in the 70s and they've continued to win, and now they've won into the next century. But the fact of the matter is, in 1990 and 91, it did not look like the team was going anywhere except down. They were the worst team in baseball, and it looked like the whole empire was falling apart.
Exactly. I mean, how they were able to turn around their fortunes, which is what makes the book so interesting, because like you said, it's got that juxtapositions where most people don't think of the Yankees as being a losing franchise at that time or at any time, but then to shine the light on that and to shine on how they changed their fortunes and were able to become the beacon that they were in the 90s.
Correct. I mean, they weren't just a losing team. Everything was going wrong. Their owner was suspended permanently from baseball. I mean, not just for a little while, permanently at the time. That was his sentence at the time. And their attendance figures are down 35%. They were really a laughingstock in Major League Baseball. They had the worst record in the history of the Yankees franchise. Their TV ratings were down. Everything. I mean, the stadium, the old Yankee Stadium, was literally crumbling. A beam fell out of the upper deck one morning and landed in the mezzanine. Fortunately, there was nobody there, so there were no injuries. But I mean, the empire was literally and figuratively crumbling. And as you said, the juxtaposition, the twist, is that actually in that time, that's when they were rebuilding, doing some extraordinary things in the minor leagues and their scouting system, and were really about to launch another run that matched some of the runs in the earlier part of the 20th century.
So why was the owner suspended?
He had a feud with his best player, Dave Winfield. George Steinbrenner had given him a contract in 1981, and there were some escalating clauses that George didn't apparently really understand or haven't explained to him properly. And when he found out he was, giving Winfield more money, he kind of always wanted some of it back, and they were battling back and forth and suing each other. And a former Winfield had a charity foundation, a former employee for that foundation, who was kind of a nefarious character, and as was later uncovered, was a known gambler, came to Steinbrenner and said, I can give you dirt on Winfield in your fight over here, in your lawsuits. And George gave him this person, Howie Spira, a check for $40,000 for the dirt on Winfield. And then, once Major League Baseball found out about that, and the FBI investigated, obviously an owner consorting with a gambler to get information on one of his own players was not in the best interest of baseball, so that's why George was suspended. But he was supposed to be suspended for 2 or 3 years, and in a weird twist, Steinbrenner kind of asked for a permanent ban. He thought somehow he would be able to manipulate that better, but it didn't work out that way.
So how did you get the idea to write this book?
Well, first of all, I lived through it. I was a Yankee beat writer in that period, and a columnist afterwards. I knew all the principals involved. I remember the whole period. But again, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier, and that's that, I felt like it was getting to be a forgotten part of history. For example, I have a 20-year-old son who grew up in the New York area and is a Yankee fan, and he has, as far as he knows, his entire life that he can remember, the Yankees were good. The Yankees were in the playoffs every year. And that's all he knows. And, yeah, he knows about, Yankees in the 70s and Thurman Munson, and he knows about Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio and Mickey Mantle, but he just thinks that's all there ever was. It just was, from the 20s until the end of the century or into the new century, they were always good. And him and others, even older people, I think, kind of forgot just how broken things were and what an incredible resurrection it was. It was really quite unforeseen. If you lived through it, as I did, nobody thought in 91 that in 5 years they would be world champions, let alone world champions 4 out of 5 years at the end of the decade. So that was the story I wanted to tell,
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like, kind of the opposite of the Cubs or the Reds or some of those other organizations where, you had fans that had never seen them win until recent for the Cubs, and then never seen them win for the Reds. And now, kind of the opposite where, they had been so used to success, kind of like the Yankees or Boston for the last 20 years or so, where you got to be reminded that, things have changed and things can change again. So you should appreciate how good that the teams are.
Yeah, and I think baseball fans in general, I think it's a little bit of a lesson in how things can turn around quickly. And frankly, part of the Yankees resurrection, which I had back then in the 90s, which I detailed, was really led by the architect of the whole thing was Gene Michael of Kent, Ohio, who, really set the plan in motion. And as it happens, even though we didn't know we didn't have a term Moneyball, Gene Michael actually used what were later called Moneyball tenants back in the 90s. This was something he always believed in. He believed that on base percentage was paramount. He believed in finding players who scored runs, and he believed in power hitting. He did still believe in some other small ball tenants, but he had a lot of those. He really was ahead of his time. So there's a lesson for all of baseball, really, in that some of these things have been around for a while, and many of the tenets that are working now are things that actually have been around for quite a while.
So at what point did they hit rock bottom?
1990, I would say, was their worst team. They lost 95 games. Everything was going wrong. I mean, and that is the year that Steinbrenner is permanently suspended. They had, believe it or not, they had a pitcher throw an 8-inning no-hitter and lose the game. I don't mean it was an 8-inning complete game no-hitter. In other words, he didn't lose it nice. They made a bunch of errors in the bottom. It was a road game in Chicago, and the Yankees made a bunch of errors in the 8th inning. White Sox scored 4 runs on 3 errors, and the Yankees are down quietly in the top of the 9th and lose 4-0, even though their pitcher never gave up a hit. That's the kind of bad karma that was enveloping the entire franchise.
Oh, wow.
Strangely, that same year, that's what I say about things that are going on behind the scenes. That same year, they signed Mariano Rivera, who's 20 years old at the time, for $2,000, and he starts his journey into the major leagues. So it's interesting to see how much was going wrong on the surface, but under the surface, they were actually doing some pretty remarkable things already.
So to the other extreme, in the late 90s, early 2000s, how does that dynasty compare to the previous dynasties, the earlier ones?
Well, it's interesting. There are some similarities. They were very strong up the middle. They had a lot of good left-handed pitching. There were things that were on those. I think pretty much all Yankee teams have had to have certain things. Partly because the way Yankee Stadium was constructed with a short right field porch. So there were similarities. There were similarities in that they had some sort of superstar guys that sort of galvanized the team and were very, very popular in the New York area. Whether it was, like a Thurman Munson or a Reggie Jackson or a Derek Jeter and a Bernie Williams and an Andy Pettit. I guess all championship teams have stars, but Yankees franchise, if dynasties, if you want to call them that, all seem to have like a couple of real marquee stars that sort of end up, transcending sport in the New York area. And Derek Jeter was a big baseball star, period, anywhere in the major leagues. The Jeter, Rivera teams are sort of in that way similar to the Mantle teams and the DiMaggio teams. And when in New York, at least, when the Yankees are winning, it's just as they have people out across the country that don't want the Yankees to win so much. The Yankees are become a foremost team in the city, and that happened with those teams too. I mean, they overshadow any other team. Certainly the Mets. They really overshadow even the football teams when the Yankees are going at that kind of rate of championship performance.
So we mentioned about where rock bottom was. Where was the pinnacle? Where was the peak for those teams?
Well, the funny thing about this book, is that in terms of, the pinnacle of those teams, I guess, would have been the 2000 World Series when they defeat the Mets. It's 4 in the last 5 years. Many people would make the case that the 2001 team was just as good or better, but as it happens, they lose to Arizona in that World Series, that really memorable, great World Series. In terms of my book, it really focuses on 89 to 95, and talks about what came to pass in 96, but it's about the resurrection. And the resurrection, in many ways, was complete in 95, but they lost in a playoff series in 95, a 5-game thrilling playoff series to Seattle. And this is part of the bittersweet ending of all this, is that Gene Michael, the general manager who, was the main protagonist in the book, gets pushed aside. When they lose that series, George Steinbrenner's kind of angry at everybody. Gene Michael gets moved out as general manager. Buck Showalter, the manager, who is another key part of the revival, gets fired. The entire scouting staff, people who signed Rivera, people who signed Jorge Posada and Andy Pettit and drafted Derek Jeter, they are fired. So there's actually a little bit of as I said, there's a bittersweet part to all of this, that the people that helped create the resurrection don't get to bask in the ticket tape parades and the celebrations of 96 and 98 and 99. They're actually gone.
What lessons should baseball fans take away from the book?
Well, I think it's really just an interesting tale about how some things in baseball, are eternal, and that you kind of have to build from a young set. You can mix in some veterans, but the most time-honored way to make these things work, whether it's the Yankees of 1990, the early 1990s, or the Houston Astros of now, is to do it with homegrown talent, to restart, rebuild, and it continues to be the right way to do it. I mean, there are parallels to, as I said, to the Houston Astros, to what's going on in San Diego right now, to what's going on with the Yankees right now. They've got some big name stars that they've signed, but they've also got quite a few people. Aaron Judge, the catcher Gary Sanchez, their baseman Andujar, and others who are homegrown talent. And they're, in some ways, they and other franchises are trying to redo that model, because it is indeed the best. It is the best model for building a championship.
Excellent. I'd like to thank our guest, Bill Pennington, Champs to Chumps, How the Worst Team in Yankees History Led to the 1990s Dynasty. Before we let you go, Bill, where on social media and the web should they check you out at?
Well, in terms of purchasing the book, it's all over Amazon, obviously, or BarnesandNoble.com. There's many places like that you can find it. The publisher is Houghton Mifflin, so that website is hmhco.com. I think those are the best places to go. My Twitter handle, if you got any questions, is Bill M. Pennington. I'll be happy to answer any questions people have or comments about the book.
Awesome. Thank you, Bill. We greatly appreciate you being on today.
Thanks for having me.